Hi folks, welcome back to Scooby Doo Month here at Creepy Puppets Presents. I'm your puppeteer Tommy, it's fall, and Scooby Doo is my pumpkin spice. So if you're new around here, I mostly talk about philosophy and theology, especially when those ideas appear in media. So yes, today we're talking about some philosophy that arises in Scooby Doo. So Scooby Doo fans may disagree on many things. For example, about whether Scrappy deserves all the hate he didn't. Or which ship is the best. It's Shaftney. But virtually all Scooby fans are in agreement about what the best and worst entries in the Scooby Doo franchise are. The best is clearly Zombie Island, and the worst, narrowly beating out Be Cool, is Return to Zombie Island. Now, I should say I don't hate Return to Zombie Island the way some fans do, probably because I suspect those fans are unaware Return takes place in an entirely separate continuity from Zombie Island, so it doesn't completely negate the original film. And yes, we will almost certainly deal with Scooby-Doo continuity before this month is over. Don't get me wrong though, Return to Zombie Island is still pretty terrible. So why should one little island in the bayous of New Orleans produce such diametrically opposed responses from the fandom? Well, aside from the latter's tone aggressively clashing with the former, I believe one important aspect lies in how the two films frame skepticism, specifically skepticism of the paranormal, which is part of the broader movement of skepticism of things lying outside scientific orthodoxy, what is broadly called the Rational Skeptic Movement, to distinguish it from philosophical skepticism, which is the position that knowledge doesn't exist. Rational skepticism is arguably an inseparable part of the DNA of the Scooby-Doo franchise, but just like gender relationships, how the franchise frames skepticism has changed over time, and recently that framing has been rather terrible. So let's explore the history of that framing and delve into some philosophical issues surrounding the Rational Skeptic Movement. But first, a caveat. I know what kind of audience a video like this might attract. My policy is, respectful disagreement is allowed, mean comments will be deleted. Read mean comments, in this case, to include questioning the intelligence or mental health of myself, my regular audience, or believers in the paranormal or religious people generally. At this time code, I present a formal syllogism with numbered premises arguing verified personal experience of the paranormal is sufficient evidence to justify belief in the paranormal. To keep this conversation productive, put the number of the premise you disagree with in your comment. All good? Okay then. Part 1. The Skeptical History of Scooby-Doo. Prominent rational skeptic Carl Sagan praised Scooby-Doo as a good way of promoting skepticism to children, in creating a show wherein, quote, every case is found to be explicable in prosaic terms, unquote. I think pop culture has probably etched this interpretation into our society's collective memory. Even some casual Scooby-Doo fans think it's always been a bad guy in a mask. Even fans who are more mid-level will talk about the Monsters Are Real series and the Bad Guys in Rubber Masks series as though they were different things. This distinction has been used in several popular videos to determine Scooby-Doo continuity. Again, we will get to that soon. But there are no classic Scooby-Doo series where the monsters aren't real. Real monsters and the real paranormal exist in every new Scooby-Doo series from Where Are You to Mystery Incorporated. And again, I'm not caught up on shows past that. In Where Are You, Charlie the Robot was real, as was the ghost that levitates the bone at the end of the episode A Night of Fright is No Delight. And the original Yeti in the Snow Ghost episode was probably real too. The new Scooby-Doo movies features Jin and a crossover with the Addams Family. Scooby-Doo show featured a real but dead and frozen shark monster. In the episode There's a Demon Shark in the Foggy Dark. The Scrappy era is chock full of real monsters, culminating in 13 Ghosts, which was entirely supernatural. The first post-Scrappy series, A Pup Named Scooby-Doo, featured a real ghost in the episode Ghost Who's Coming to Dinner. What's New Scooby-Doo featured the Coral Monster, and in the spin-off movies associated with that show, the Loch Ness Monster and the Samurai Ghosts, and also a dragon. Get a Clue doesn't count. Mystery Incorporated features an alien as its main antagonist, and that's the end of where I've seen enough to have an informed decision. So the paranormal has always been a reality in the world of Scooby-Doo, and early on the gang were not, on the whole, skeptical of the paranormal generally. So In That Snow Ghost episode from the original series, for example, the gang immediately believe in the reality of and run from the snow ghost upon first seeing him. Occasionally somebody will say something like, there's no such thing as ghosts. Velma tells Daphne there's no such thing as fortune-telling in the episode A Gaggle of Galloping Ghosts, but it doesn't appear to have been sort of a pervasive attitude in the early series that the paranormal or monsters can't exist. The new Scooby Doo Mysteries is a rather interesting case, though. Daphne is initially skeptical of the paranormal. She frequently says, "Oh, Scooby, there's no such thing as ghosts," as she wasn't around for the paranormal shenanigans of Shaggy, Scooby, and Scrappy during their solo adventures in the preceding series. But as that series does involve paranormal threats, she does eventually come around. Turning to the films that started this conversation, the most explicit skeptical tone in Zombie Island is Fred. As the paranormal stuff starts happening, Velma and Daphne slowly accept the reality of zombies, but Fred obstinately refuses to believe until the It's Terror Time Again sequence, when the gang is swarmed with zombies, some decapitated, and bisected. I'm pretty sure this movie was the first time I ever heard the word skeptic. Anybody else have that feeling? Fred's skepticism is pretty typical of how skeptics are framed in horror media. Stubbornly skeptical, even after another character, skeptical but more open-minded, becomes convinced. The skeptic is then either forcibly convinced and humbled, or in more adult-oriented horror, eaten. I have a pet hypothesis that this is because horror fans who believe in the paranormal find themselves represented in supernatural horror media, a world in which the paranormal is unambiguously real, and the haters and doubters get eaten. I think, for me, Blair Witch 2 is one of my favorite horror movies, despite it being complete schlock, and I know it's complete schlock, because I feel represented by the believing half of the characters in that movie. And since most people believe in at least something paranormal, probably the majority of audiences rejoice when the monster eats the skeptic. I think this is why Kate Micucci's turn as Velma has irritated so many fans. She's written to be as much of an obnoxious skeptic as Fred was in Zombie Island, but the narrative is clearly on her side instead of punishing her. Even though the supernatural still ambiguously exists in Return and in 13 Ghosts, Velma doesn't learn of it, so there's no humbling of the skeptic trope coming into play, and I feel that the audience feels cheated. But why does the audience prefer to see the skeptic humbled? Well, have you met many real-life skeptics? Part 2, my personal experience with the Rational Skeptic Movement. So I realize most of the people watching this found my channel within the last 2 months. Thanks for the subs. If you haven't subscribed before, I would appreciate it if you would go and subscribe now, and give me a like as well. So, I've told this story before in past videos, but I'm gonna briefly recap it for our new friend. I was an active member in the atheist and rational skeptic subcultures from my early teens through late undergrad, so from about the early 2000s to about the early 2010. I had an autistic special interest in evolutionary biology for most of that time, and although I was interested in the paranormal, like I was involved with LaVey and Satanism, I had lots of problems with my parents' religion, Catholicism, and the ascendant fundamentalism of the W. Bush years. Also, just look at college me. Would I be anything but an atheist and a skeptic? And I was active in the atheist and skeptic movement too. I twice had dinner with David Silverman, and I had a nice email conversation with Matt Dillahunty, whom I still have a lot of respect for. I left both subcultures for a couple of reasons. One, I became a dual major in biology and philosophy, and as I studied idealist philosophers like Plato and the Samkhya yogis of India, I found myself persuaded by the arguments for an idealist conception of God. I actually have a video from like 2 years ago outlining the specific argument. Go check that out, but to sum it up briefly, we start with a definition of parsimony and show idealist conceptions of God are the most parsimonious possible explanations for the universe. So I couldn't continue to be affiliated with the atheist subculture after I became a theist. But I also left because the atheist and rational skeptic subcultures were becoming increasingly toxic. Though the skeptic community wouldn't go full reactionary until Gamergate, which was after I left, misogyny, transphobia, and ableism were already growing problems in the movement. But the biggest problem in the movement is what I like to call performative rationality, the desire to be seen as acting smart. I think a lot of lonely people with not a lot going for them can feel validated in their, quote, intelligence by joining a movement obsessed with intelligence and learning how to debate poorly educated fundamentalists as sort of a self-esteem boost. While there are obviously smart and well-educated skeptics and atheists out there, in my experience, the rank-and-file skeptics are socially maladjusted reactionary neckbeards, which, again, I can relate to, with only a high school level understanding of evolution and virtually no education in philosophy. Not to brag, but I have a master's degree in the former and a bachelor's in the latter. I'm sorry if this sounds cruel, but the atheist and skeptic communities don't have to be so toxic and reactionary, at least not in all aspects. I do think there are specific toxic reactionary ideas in the skeptic community, though, that are inseparable from rational skepticism. First, to see the first, let's return to Carl Sagan. When contrasting Scooby Doo favorably to the X-Files, he says of the latter, "Almost never does the paranormal claim turn out to be a hoax or a psychological aberration, or a misunderstanding of the natural world." I think that sums up the problem most people have with rational skepticism nicely. Every paranormal experience anyone has ever had is either lying, has been deceived, has misunderstood some phenomenon of accepted scientific orthodoxy, or is crazy. We have a word for getting people to doubt their own perceptions: gaslighting. Rational skepticism is the gaslighting of humanity. I think most people know that. They feel it, even subconsciously. I think this is probably the biggest contributing factor to our culture's negative attitude towards skeptics. Real quick, just as an aside. The term gaslighting comes from the 1938 play Gaslight, and as I write this, I just got the news that the star of the 1944 film adaptation of Gaslight, Dame Angela Lansbury, passed away today at the age of 96. I've always been a big fan of her work, from Sweeney Todd to The Manchurian Candidate to Murder, She Wrote. I'm kind of at a loss for words to adequately express my sadness right now, but as a veteran of Broadway, I'm sure Dame Lansbury would agree the show must go on. The second inseparable problem with skepticism is the movement's historical connections to racism and colonialism. I've recently been reading Hungan Hector's book on Puerto Rican Mesa Blanca Spiritism. You may recall I started practicing Mesa Blanca Spiritism over the summer after practicing European Spiritism for several years. Hungan Hector describes an alliance in Puerto Rico of Protestant missionaries and the new U.S. territorial government to discredit Mesa Blanca practitioners as irrational and superstitious, and spiritist leaders and faith healers as, quote, charlatans. Rational skepticism uses the language and logic of colonizer governments to delegitimize indigenous religions and indigenous religious leaders who may serve as opposition to colonial regime. And it's difficult to see how rational skepticism can move forward and move away from calling things ignorant and fraudulent. So remember how I said in the beginning that I talk about theology in my videos? Well, I have an ongoing series on agnosticism and atheism, and at the end of my most recent entry, I said my next video in the series would be an argument for why verified personal experience of the paranormal should count as sufficient evidence for the paranormal. The rest of this video, minus the conclusions, will be that video. Though obviously this version will be written for a more general audience than that one would have been. See, statisticians have a way of explicitly calculating whether a proposition has sufficient evidence, so I'm about to gloss over a whole bunch of math. Part 3. The Diagnostic Test. So diagnostic test problems are encountered in every Intro to Biostats class in every college in the world, probably. We start with a clinical lab test. Let's say it's a lab test for the presence of cancer. The test starts with a specific raw output. Let's say it directly measures the presence or absence of a protein indicative of cancer. We then convert this output into a probability of having cancer given our test result using Bayes' theorem. This calculation requires three pieces of information: the overall probability of the test result, the probability of the test result when the patient has cancer, and the probability of the patient having cancer before the test was administered. The first two values come from peer-reviewed studies of the test, and the third can be calculated from demographic information. So now we have a probability of having cancer of, let's say, 68%. But does that mean I have cancer or not? Well, we can use receiver operating characteristic, or ROC, analysis to convert continuous probabilities into binary choice. We want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. To wit, we want to have the lowest error. ROC analysis works by drawing an arbitrary threshold through the data, saying, let's believe everything above this line and disbelieve everything below this. We'll calculate an error rate and then repeat until the lowest error is reached. Since having cancer when the result is negative is much worse than being diagnosed with cancer when you don't in fact have cancer, we typically allow for higher false positive rates than false negative results. We call this a weighted ROC threshold. But if truth is what you care about primarily, then we use an unweighted ROC threshold, which gives you the lowest overall error. So for binary outcomes, having cancer versus not having cancer, the unweighted ROC threshold is almost always 50%. Generally, we think it is rational to believe you have cancer and irrational to disbelieve you have cancer if your test says you, quote, have cancer after the application of the ROC threshold. Bayes' theorem basically says the posterior or evidential probability of a hypothesis is equal to the ordinariness of the hypothesis times the extraordinariness of the evidence, here expressed as how much more likely the evidence is if the hypothesis is true. My plan is to use the diagnostic test model to evaluate the rationality of paranormal beliefs, using the fact that all cultures across time and space have believed in the paranormal as my raw test outcome for the binary response, the paranormal exists. We need 3 pieces of information. How likely is it that the paranormal exists before we administer the test? How likely are we to have paranormal experiences generally? And how much more likely are we to have paranormal experiences if the paranormal world really exists? Now here's the thing. How do we gauge ordinariness of a claim without prior data? Well, usually the best case is to be agnostic, that is, to set the prior probability at 50% and use evidence to converge on the true probability. I technically need infinite evidence to guarantee convergence to the true probability, but this trick usually works well even with finite evidence. We could be here arguing forever about the prior probability of the paranormal. The most rational choice is to be truly agnostic about it and let the evidence decide for us. How accurate are paranormal experiences? I know what you're going to say here. Eyewitness testimony is the least reliable form of evidence, yada yada yada. But actually, as this meta-study points out, the unreliability of eyewitness testimony is tied to memory, not perception. When recorded immediately, the accuracy of eyewitness perception has been clocked at anywhere between 85 and 96%. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to simulate 10,000 worlds. The paranormal will exist in half of them, true agnostic. In 85% of the worlds where paranormal exists, there will be a universal belief in the paranormal. 15% of such worlds will not. In worlds where the paranormal does not exist, 85% will have no universal paranormal beliefs, and 15% will. There's no evidence from the literature about an asymmetry in perception. We will calculate the evidential probability and ROC threshold from this dataset, and we'll do it in R. So when we do this, the evidential probability of the paranormal turns out to be 85%, because the probability of evidence turned out to be 50%, which canceled the 50% prior probability, while the unweighted ROC threshold is predictably 50%. Because the evidential probability, 85%, exceeds the ROC threshold, 50%, we say the paranormal exists in the same sense that you, quote, have cancer after a positive cancer test result. Part 4. The syllogism. I know my logic fans would prefer my argument as a formal syllogism, so here that goes. Premise 1. It is rational to believe and irrational to disbelieve any hypothesis whose evidential probability of hypothesis given evidence, exceeds its unweighted ROC threshold. We'll call this the diagnostic test axiom. The prior probability of the hypothesis, P of H, for the existence of the paranormal is 50%. That's the agnostic axiom. The existence of paranormal experiences in every culture across time and space constitutes evidence of the paranormal. Let's call this the perception axiom. Premise 4. The probability of paranormal experience in every culture if the paranormal is real, probability of evidence given the truth of the hypothesis, and the probability of no paranormal experience if the paranormal is not real, the probability of the absence of evidence given the falsehood of the hypothesis is 85%, and this comes from peer-reviewed literature. Premise 5, from points 2 and 4, the evidential probability of the paranormal is 85%, which we arrive at through Bayes' theorem, and premise 6, the unweighted ROC threshold for this dataset is 50% based on the simulation study. Therefore, 7, from 1 and 6, it is rational to believe and irrational to disbelieve in the paranormal. Let me just respond to the 2 most common objections I'm likely to get. First, Firstly, perhaps you think there's some compelling reason to reject the agnostic axiom. You think there is some compelling reason to clock the probability of the paranormal at less than 50%. Well, assuming an evidential strength probability of evidence given hypothesis of symmetric 85%, we can plot the evidential probability against the prior probability like so. Remember, anyone holding a position above the blue line must believe in the paranormal to be rational. What's so interesting about this graph is how far into skepticism rational paranormal belief goes. Even if you only had a 20% or 25% prior belief in the paranormal, universal paranormal experiences should compel you to believe in it. I think this tells us something important about skeptical framing. Open-minded skeptics like Daphne, in most incarnations, let's say in the 25 to 30% range, who come to believe in the paranormal after having their own paranormal experiences, are not vilified to the same degree as closed-minded skeptics like Fred in Zombie Island or Velma in Return and Curse. It's good, narratively speaking, to be a little skeptical, but narratively bad to be so skeptical as to, for example, posit animatronics as the zombie horde surrounds you. My point is that the humbled skeptic trope isn't saying all skepticism is bad, it's just excessive skepticism, and that maps neatly onto what we find here. I also think this result exposes something we have all suspected about rational skeptics and atheists. They actively believe God or ghosts don't exist, or at least that the probability of their existence is extremely low, even if they tell us they aren't making claims. This graph suggests that the mere fact that they doubt and are asking for evidence belies an implicit claim in the non-existence of whatever they're skeptical about. Secondly, perhaps you think 85% is too high a measure of the accuracy of perceptual evidence. Well, it turns out that any strength of evidence arbitrarily greater than 50%, assuming symmetricality, so the true positive rate is equal to negative rate, must compel the rational agnostic to believe in the paranormal. We can combine both graphs by plotting the strength of evidence against the prior probability. Any position in the light blue half of the graph is evidentially justified. The red rectangle approximately represents our simulation study. Part 5. Conclusion. Over the last 50 years of its existence, the Scooby Doo franchise has promoted skepticism of the paranormal. It's an essential part of the series' identity, but pop culture, and apparently the writers, have conveniently forgotten that skepticism in the show had always been open-minded, and real monsters have always existed in Scooby-Doo. Recent Scooby-Doo, particularly series featuring Kate Micucci's Velma, write Velma as a closed-minded skeptic who goes unhumbled, much to the consternation of most of the audience. Why do we want to see skeptics humbled? Well, the Rational Skeptical Movement is largely composed of toxic, racist, gaslighting neckbeards obsessed with proving how much smarter they are than you. Even when we've shown that given reasonable assumptions, there is sufficient evidence to rationally believe in the paranormal. I hope the way this franchise frames skepticism goes back to the way it had been historically. I think another good round of monsters being real and the main antagonist done well could really do wonders for the revitalization of this franchise. That's all for now, folks. Take care.